For 10 years, he was a medical mystery. He was exhausted, pale, his heart would race for no reason. And the answer was in the blue can he held in his hand every single day. He just couldn't see it. This is the story of a man who spent a decade gaslighting himself into believing a lie that was turning his body into a prison. And the truth, when it finally hit him, was as simple as it was terrifying. Our storyteller is 30 years old now. But this story begins when he was 20. Like a lot of people his age, he discovered the crisp, cold jolt of a Monster energy drink. Specifically, the blue one. The Absolutely Zero. It started innocently enough. 1 a day. Maybe 2 if he was gaming late or had a big project. It was his fuel, his focus. But over the next 10 years, that habit slowly, insidiously, became his entire world. By the end, it wasn't 1 or 2 cans. It was a minimum of 4. Sometimes 5. Every single day. 1 when he woke up. 1 mid-morning. 1 with lunch. 1 in the afternoon. And yes, even 1 right before bed. When he says he drank only Monster, you have to understand he means it literally. Water was an afterthought, a foreign concept. He might have a single glass when his throat felt like sandpaper in the morning, or another before collapsing into bed at night. But for the 16 hours he was awake, conscious, and moving through the world, the only liquid that passed his lips came from that signature blue and black can. It was more than a drink, it was a ritual. The moment he sat down at his computer, his brain screamed for it. It was a Pavlovian response. The click and hiss of the can opening was the starting pistol for work, for gaming, for life. Nothing else tasted right. Water felt empty, lifeless. Now, before you judge, hear this part. His brain, desperate to protect this addiction, performed the most incredible mental gymnastics you've ever heard. Here was the core of his delusion. He believed he was immune to caffeine. It sounds insane, right? But his logic was simple. He could chug a full can at 11 o'clock at night and still fall asleep. Therefore, caffeine just didn't affect him anymore. He'd built up a tolerance, an immunity. He was special. He'd hacked his own biology. He ignored decades of science. He ignored the worried looks from friends. He ignored the basic, fundamental fact that the human body is made of water. He ignored it all because admitting the truth meant giving up the one thing that felt normal. But his body couldn't be ignored forever. It started sending out distress signals. For years, he dragged himself from one doctor's appointment to another, a walking paradox. He'd sit there, explaining his symptoms, all while his system was flooded with stimulants. First, there was the exhaustion. A deep, chronic, soul-crushing fatigue. He felt perpetually flat, like a battery that could never hold a charge. How could he be so tired when he was consuming hundreds of milligrams of caffeine every single day? It made no sense. Then, there was his appearance. He was ashen, pale. He looked like he was living in a basement, starved of sunlight. He recently noticed the dark circles under his eyes had become so pronounced, so sunken, that he looked like he hadn't had a good night's sleep since 2014. He looked haunted. And his weight. He couldn't lose a single pound. He'd try dieting, he'd track his calories, he'd be in a massive deficit on paper, but the scale would not budge. It was like his metabolism had just given up. It was stuck, frozen in a permanent error state, refusing to cooperate. But the most terrifying symptom? The one he actively chose to ignore? His heart. He'd be sitting perfectly still, just watching a video or reading an email, and suddenly his heart would start hammering against his ribs. A frantic, racing pulse out of nowhere. Or he'd feel a weird flutter, a palpitation that made him catch his breath. He knew. Deep down, he knew it was the caffeine. He wasn't stupid, but admitting it meant the whole house of cards would come crashing down. So he'd take a deep breath, wait for it to pass, and crack open another can. What happened next is the part one still can't believe. The moment of clarity didn't come from a doctor. It didn't come from a dramatic health scare or an intervention. It came from Google. About 2 months ago, staring at his ghoulish reflection in the mirror, he decided to research the cause of his dark, sunken eye circles. He typed the words into the search bar, and as he scrolled through the results, dehydration, stress, exhaustion, it was like a switch flipped in his brain. A 10-year-old light bulb finally flickered on. Dehydration, stress, high caffeine levels. It wasn't 3 separate issues. It was one. It was the can in his hand. He wasn't immune to caffeine. He was just so deeply addicted, so chronically overstimulated and simultaneously dehydrated, that his body was in a constant state of emergency. The exhaustion wasn't in spite of the monster, it was because of it. His body was fighting a never-ending war against the chemicals he was pouring into it, and it was losing. The reason he could sleep after a late night wasn't immunity. It was his body finally shutting down from sheer exhaustion, passing out despite the stimulants. The realization was mortifying. He had spent a decade and a small fortune on doctors, complaining about symptoms while actively causing them. He had manipulated himself, lied to himself, constructed an entire false reality just to protect a habit. He felt incredibly, profoundly stupid. That was the day everything changed. He made a new rule. A maximum of 2 cans a day, and absolutely none after 3 in the afternoon. Everything else had to be water. He started adding lemon, just to give it some flavor, to trick his brain into accepting it. And it was hard. It is still hard. Every time he sits at his desk, the craving hits him like a physical blow. His hand instinctively reaches for the fridge door. The addiction has carved deep grooves into his brain, and every sip of water is a conscious, deliberate act of defiance against a decade of conditioning. The taste of that blue can is something he still craves. It's a bittersweet poison he grew to love. He wishes they made a caffeine-free version, but they don't. And maybe that's for the best. He's sharing this story as a final closing chapter for himself. A public admission of a private, decade-long delusion. It's a warning, a cautionary tale about how easily we can fool ourselves. How the brain will do anything to protect an addiction, even if it means destroying the body it lives in. He was a zombie, and he didn't even know it. But now, he's finally waking up. This isn't just a story about energy drinks. It's a terrifying look at the power of self-deception. He built a reality where he was the exception to the rule, where his body operated on a different set of principles than everyone else's. And he did it all to protect a simple, daily habit that was slowly, quietly ruining his life from the inside out. Was this just a silly habit that got out of hand, or is it a serious warning about how easily our minds can betray our bodies? And what's the one, harmless, lie you've been telling yourself for years?